Jewish comedy tends to resist any single explanation. For every argument that's been advanced as to what it really is, a bit of thought immediately reveals all sorts of exceptions and counterexamples. So much so that other equally perspicacious critics have thrown up their hands and suggested any attempt to define a specifically Jewish humor is doomed to futility. What's more, the counterexamples themselves aren't just indicative, they're almost as vast and numerous as Jewish history itself, which covers a lot of ground, of both the actual and metaphorical variety. Writing a book that tries to touch on all of it, even representatively, as well as offer some explanatory power, is a pretty tall order. Still, someone ought to do it. The first time I walked into a Columbia University classroom to teach a course on Jewish comedy, Seinfeld had just gone off the air and Lena Dunham was entering high school. Judd Apatow was a respected television producer who no one outside the industry had ever heard of, and The Producers was still a movie, though there was talk of taking it to Broadway. I was a little nervous, a wet behind the ears 27-year-old assistant professor lecturing to the largest class I'd ever had. Apparently this was the kind of course that could attract a crowd, and I looked down at my notes to focus myself. Jewish comedy is serious business, I'd typed across the top. And so it is. Over the last 15 years or so of teaching the subject, lots of things have changed, although thanks to the magic of syndication, Seinfeld never really did go off the air. And my syllabus has changed with it. But the top line hasn't, along with the two central realizations that accompanied it. First, the story of Jewish comedy was almost as massive in scope, as meaningful in substance as Jewish history itself. In fact, I realized as I refined and developed the class, I was looking at a tradition, one with a history that could and should be studied. The story of Jewish comedy, what Jewish humor did and meant for the Jews at different times and places, as well as how and why it was so entertaining, is, if you tell it the right way, the story of American popular culture. It's the story of Jewish civilization. It's a guide to an essential aspect of human behavior. The fact that it also happens to be immensely entertaining to read, talk, and teach about is something of a bonus. But, second, you can't include everything, or even close. And so what you did include, I realized, had to work not just as a catalog of Jewish comedic production, but as an argument about what precisely Jewish comedy consists of. But even before you get to the cataloging and taxonomizing, there has to be some defining, some inclusion and exclusion. Is the raw stuff of Jewish humor so capacious that it includes anything written by a Jew that might raise the faintest scintilla of a smile? Well, no. That would be, if not entirely ridiculous, at least ridiculously unhelpful. And literature is littered with brilliant comic thinkers who have warned against trying to define comedy too precisely. Samuel Johnson's "Comedy has been unpropitious to definers" is the most famous, though I kind of prefer Swift's rhyming couplet that "what humor is not all the tribe of logic mongers can describe." But this logic monger would like to set two conditions nonetheless. First, Jewish humor has to be produced by Jews. Maybe this is obvious, maybe it isn't, but it's part of our ground rules. How someone defines their Jewishness is a notoriously tricky subject, and, counter to some people's thinking, has been since the beginning of Jewish history. But anyone who defines themselves as Jewish in any way is potentially part of our subject. Even if sometimes mistaken for Jews, Charlie Chaplin looking at you, are out. This said, comedy, especially in performance media, is of course often collaborative, and oftentimes a great work of Jewish comedy is crafted in concert with non-Jews. This material is very much included. The second, trickier condition. Jewish humor must have something to do with either contemporary Jewish living or historical Jewish existence. Jewish history is very long, and Jewish life extraordinarily diverse, both geographically and culturally. It would be surprising if all examples of Jewish comedy looked the same, and they certainly don't. But all those different times and places featured Jews commenting on what it meant to be a Jew in that culture. Usually, since most of Jewish history is diasporic history, as some kind of cultural outsider. But even if not, almost inevitably with that sidelong, half-immersed, half-alienated glance so crucial to comedy.